Good afternoon, and I'm happy that we actually have our next restoration seminar. And I'm to welcome here Mark Mariano, one of our grad students, and I should say one of our first restoration certificate graduate, and a good friend of mine whom I got known just when I arrived here to Butte. And we kind of have a long story. He introduced me to so many things here in Montana. Also fishing. I never really tried fishing here, but he was a guy who took me out and made me like it. I'm not somebody who is all the time out, but he tries, and I really appreciate his whole being here, because we learn from each other a lot, I guess. So before Mark starts his presentation, I would like to also introduce him officially to everybody, because not everybody might know who Mark Mariano is. So Mark Mariano received both an associate's degree and a carpentry and a bachelor's degree in ecological restoration from the University of Montana. He has worked on restoration projects all over western Montana, California, and western Nevada. Mark is currently finishing up the interdisciplinary master's program with a restoration certificate here at Montana Tech. Additionally, Mark has been given the opportunity to share his passion for fish biology and conservation, environmental issues, and construction science as an adjunct instructor in both Montana Tech campuses. This is shortly about Mark. He has a lot of different skills you would never think, but he's really a handy guy all over our projects. So welcome, and this is Mark's restoration certificate and master's project. He did a lot of different research. He will talk about it, and he got really enthusiastic about figuring out what Crested Wheatgrass does to our restoration here in Butte. So Mark, welcome. And
thank you.
Be with you.
So as Dr. Payal mentioned, this is the core of my research, and I've done a bunch of other things during my time here. So thanks for coming. And the talk, as you can see, is titled The Effects of an Exotic Reclamation Grass on the Restoration of the Butte Hill. So, in today's presentation, we'll have a brief history of crested wheatgrass and why it is in Butte, Montana. I think most of you probably know, but it'll be good to go over that. Some biological and ecological problems associated with this species. We'll go over my research goals and some of my preliminary results. I still have a lot more work to do, but I'm getting some cool results back. And this is from another presentation, so we probably won't talk about the GIS model unless anyone has questions about that. So, crested wheatgrass, scientific name is agropyron cristatum. It's a C3 cool season grass species. It's drought tolerant, and it resists weed invasions in its non-native range. And we'll go over why that is a little bit. So here's a cool picture that Robert gave me of crested. It's kind of hard to see with the lights, but this is seen in its homeland, essentially, and with its homeland friends. So even in its native range in Eurasia, it is a pioneer species, which means that it is one of the first to inhabit a site after some type of a disturbance. So you can see some of its Eurasian friends. This is St. John's wort. If anyone's ever driven through Idaho or California, this is the yellow flower on the side of the highway. And there's also some thistles in there, which we have in Montana, which are not native as well. So we'll keep moving along. So like I said, it's a Eurasian grass, and it comes from Europe, Asia, and specifically the steppe region of Siberia. And so what is it doing in North America? Well, here's the USDA map of its distribution by state. Dillman in 1960 described 2 species of crested wheatgrass. One, agropyron cristatum, that's the one we're talking about today, and another one, agropyron desertorum, which, like its name suggests, is a desert species. So if you look at the map, this kind of shows the northern region, which would be more agropyron cristatum, and then the desertorum would fill in the southwest, some of these southern Midwestern states, and then Mexico, which the USDA doesn't recognize for some reason. Lessica, Peter Lessica and DeLuca, in a paper they wrote in 1996, said that it is the most commonly planted exotic grass in western North America, and there's over 5 million acres of it. So mostly on a day-to-day basis, it's planted for hay and pasture. It's a good forage crop for cows. But the big reason that it's distributed so widely across western North America is because of the Dust Bowl. So as many of you know, large portions of the American prairie were plowed for crop production in the early 1900s. And this was followed by a monster drought, which caused crop failures, and a lot of these farmers abandoned their land. Right after that, the soil that was now exposed and cut and plowed became mobile, so the dust or the soil essentially blew all over the place in huge, crazy dust storms. And to keep the plains soil in place as best as possible after some of these dust storms became a really huge issue, the government utilized crested wheatgrass as a cover crop because it grows so fast and readily, and it's hardy, and that's that. It's also used widely for surface mine reclamation. So surface coal mineral mines, leach pads, waste rock, and mine tailings. And that, of course, brings us to why it's in Butte. So in Butte, the reclamation and cleanup actions were ordered in 1988, and they're still ongoing today. These wastes in Butte were graded to have a less of a slope for erosion control. They were capped with clean soils brought in from all sorts of places. And these reclamation efforts, as a lot of you know, utilized mostly exotic species, and the main species was crested wheatgrass. So here's an old picture of Butte. The place was turned inside out. There's 10,000 plus miles of tunnels supposedly underneath town, and for the longest time, the waste rocks from this mining activity was just left at the surface. So reclamation, here's a classic example of the Butte reclamation. This is the Mountain Carn Mine Yard, and you can see it abandoned at whatever point in time this was, once mining stopped, once the underground mining stopped. And then this must have been circa 1990s something, where you can see that a lot of the debris was removed, the grading happened, the cap was placed on top of that, it's supposed to be 18 inches. And then those little bitty green bits of grass coming up is our crested wheatgrass friend. So here's a cool thing I did on Google Earth showing the extent of this capping and revegetation. Here's the Butte Hill in 1995, so some work had already taken place. And here's the Butte Hill 2 years ago, year and a half ago, in 2015. I made this picture black and white because one of the fun things to do is to go back and forth and look how much land in our town, how many acres was reclaimed. And the majority of this revegetation used for this reclamation utilized crested wheatgrass. So if you ever go walking around on the walking trail or in any of the old mine yards that have been reclaimed and look down at your feet, this is usually what you're going to see. So this is a monoculture, meaning that there's only one species. And this is a pretty normal scene on the Butte Hill these days. So here's some ecological problems caused by crested wheatgrass. D'Alessandro et al. In 2013, in a paper they published in 2013, showed that the more crested wheatgrass you have, the less number of species or biological diversity there is. So the y-axis here shows crested wheatgrass in grams per meter square, and the x shows the number of species. And then, as you can see, as your grams per meter square of crested wheatgrass goes up, your number of species goes down. And one of the reasons why this is happening is because of those dense monotypic stands. It's extremely resistant to other species recolonization, and that can be a good thing if you're talking about weeds. That's one of the reasons that they use that species. But it's also a bad thing if you've got a project which is attempting to install native plants in these areas. It also, this lack of biodiversity and monoculture has little to no benefits for bird, wildlife, and other pollinators. Here's a couple biological problems with crested. In the long run, due to intra-species competition, can lead to increased bare ground and erosion. So that's bad news if what you were going for was to keep these mine caps in place, and in our case, for the sake of human health. Crested wheatgrass also decreases the amount of available soil nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon. So it's leaving not a lot for the other species to work with. And it can exaggerate the effects of the buttes of the waste caps, which are already disturbed soil. So when you take soil and disturb it, it causes a lot of issues. And that's what happened when it was used as a cap. And now that there's the crested on top of that, these effects are exaggerated. So my graduate work sought to build evidence that crested wheatgrass might be potentially allelopathic. And this would be one of the tools it would use to keep other plants growing around it. And I'll tell you what that is in a minute. Allelopathy. So I performed 4 experiments to do this. The first one is a greenhouse experiment using soils that I took from the waste caps. The second one was another greenhouse experiment that was testing native grass litter versus crested grass litter. The third was a Petri dish experiment with these same litters. And the fourth is another Petri dish experiment with a leaf litter extract. So what's allelopathy? The etymology of the word is that it comes from allelon, which means of each other, and pathos, which means to suffer. So there's a definition from Cornell University. Allelopathy refers to the chemical inhibition of one species by another, and the inhibitory chemical released into the environment is released to the environment where it affects the development and growth of neighboring plants. So that's bad news if you're a native plant trying to spread on into these areas. So here's experiment 1. I wanted to investigate whether allelochemicals in the soil may be inhibiting native plant growth. And what I did was I grew out 2 native species in soil that I collected from areas on the hill that were heavily infested, if I may, with crested wheatgrass, moderately infested and non-infested, to make a control for each of these categories. I used activated carbon. This is a technique that's been used by some of our colleagues and others in the plant science field. And then I measured above and below ground growth, the number of leaves, and the weight of the entire plant. So here's some results from experiment 1 that looked just like our hypothesis would have guessed it. On the y-axis here, we've got the mean above ground length, and on the x is the infestation category. The plant that this specific graph is referring to is Hobel's rockcress. It's a native species. And we have our 3 infestation categories. So soils taking from the heavy infestation, the moderate infestation, and the non-infested areas. And then you can see that there's 2 more categories. The darker bars represent the experiment with activated carbon, so think black for carbon, right? And then no activated carbon is the gray. So because the activated carbon was a control and it was used to negate the potential allelopathic chemicals, you would expect there to be no difference between the 3 infestation categories, and that's exactly what we saw. And then additionally, you would expect that the heaviest infestation, if there was allelopathy going on, would have the lowest mean above ground growth for this species, followed by a little bit higher for the moderate, and then in the non-infested areas you have the highest amount, or the highest lengths of above ground growth on these Bocera plants. The second native species was a grass, and similarly we have our above ground growth on this axis, and our infestation categories are exactly the same. The activated C is the same with the darker bars. And here something funny is going on with the moderate, but you still see relatively no trend as far as the control goes, and the heaviest infestation had the lowest above ground growth for blue bunch wheatgrass. The moderate infestation had higher, and then something happened with the non-infested. So that's really all I've got to say about experiment 1. Experiment 2 sought to look at the litter layer. So one thing that's happening with the crested wheatgrass in Butte is that there is leaf litter buildup. And this is because we live in a cold, dry climate, and so things don't degrade or break down as fast, right? And the other reason is because this is a non-native species, which has a little bit different, biochemistry going on. The soil biota in our native soils, or somewhat native soils in this case, may not have the tools to readily break it down as it would if it was a native plant as well. So what you get is this monster litter layer buildup. I went around the hill and took 200 plus measurements on a variety of the caps, and found that the average litter depth is about 7.6 centimeters. And experiment 2 wanted to look again at the same type deals. Is this litter layer itself allelopathic, or is it just a physical barrier to seeds? So what I did was deposit these seeds from 4 native species, 2 forbs and 2 grasses, on top of rocket pots in the greenhouse that mimicked that 7.6 layer depth, and I used 1 native litter, Great Basin wild rye, the crested wheatgrass litter, of course, and then the control in this case was just no litter at all. And then I made this a little easier to follow. That's a lot of text on that side. So Great Basin wild rye is the big, huge grass that you see on a lot of the reclaim sites. You see it around in Anaconda a lot. It can be taller than you. It's usually a big bunch, and it's native. And it was used for reclamation as well. And the crested wheatgrass, here's a close-up of the seed head, and it should look familiar if you spend any time outside in Butte. So these pictures represent the litters that I used: Great Basin wild rye and crested wheatgrass. Here's a picture of the 4 native plant species I picked. The main reason that these 4 species were picked is that they do not require any type of a treatment. And if you came to crystal biologist talk for the seminar a week or so ago, she gave examples of all sorts of treatments she has to do to get a lot of these native plants growing. These 4 require none. You put the seed in the ground and they grow. That takes out any error that could have happened from mistreatment or differences in treatment. There's 2 forbs, Hobel's rockcress and white sagebrush, and 2 grasses, prairie June grass and blue bunch wheatgrass. And what I did to make it easier to follow in the following graphs is I've color-coded them. So even if you don't know plants very well or you can't follow along so hot, I've got the Hobel's rockcress is orange because that's kind of the color of their seeds. White sagebrush is gray because it's gray. Prairie June grass is green. And blue bunch I colored blue because it's in the name. So for experiment 2, ignore the chart on the right for a minute. Here's some preliminary results. On this axis here, we've got a count of germinated seeds. So that's just how many seeds of these native species germinated, whether or not they survived very long or not. And then down here we have our types of treatment. So the crested wheatgrass litter, the Great Basin wild rye litter, and the control that had no litter. And you can see right off the bat that there's a shocking lack of germination in both the crested wheatgrass litter and the Great Basin wild rye litter. And it's important to differentiate something at this point, and that is that in native grasslands around the Butte area, anyway, the litter buildup doesn't build up as it does with the crested wheatgrass on the mine caps. So I mimicked the depth of litter for both the native and non-native species, but in reality, the native species wouldn't have done that, right? And then in the control, they grew just fine, like you'd imagine. So that's that one. This silly graph over here is making another point that the only thing that did grow in either of these types of leaf litter was that species itself. So in the crested wheatgrass, I'm sorry, I didn't change the scientific names there, but this one's crested wheatgrass and this one's Great Basin wild rye. 15 seeds that were in that litter already, I didn't clean them out, just part of the litter, they germinated. And the same as in the Great Basin wild rye. So what it's showing is the only thing that grows in this extreme litter layer is that plant itself, whether it be crested wheatgrass or Great Basin wild rye. One thing I have to do, and I wanted to do it the week it started snowing, which put a damper on my plans, was go out and quantify the difference in, take average litter depths of the native grassland. So I've got that 7.6, and I'm sure that if I went out to the native grassland, it would be significantly less, but I can't make a claim unless I can show it. So that's a future task of mine. Experiment 3 was a fun one. This one looked at the effect of the leaf litter germination rates when grown in a Petri dish. So the idea with this is that the last experiment doesn't really tease out whether it was allelopathy or a physical barrier, right? In this case, it would, or it should. The same amount of leaf litter was put in for each of the categories. Again, this is crested wheatgrass, this is Great Basin wild rye, and to mimic the physical barrier, I used a mixture of Easter grass, because that's, it's pretty grassy. And then when I was working with it, I realized that none of the grass litter I was getting actually was only leaf bits only. It's got a lot of stems in it. So I used drinking straws at various different diameters to mimic the stems. And then, of course, a control with no litter at all. And the results looked something like this. And again, exactly what you'd expect if this was going on. So we'll go species by species, and remember they're color-coded. This axis has germination rate, so it's the amount of seeds that germinated. And the x-axis has the experimental litter type, so Crested, Great Basin wild rye, the Easter grass mimic, and a control with no litter at all. The white sagebrush grew or germinated less in the crested, more in the wild rye, even more in the Easter grass, and the most in the control. So it made a perfect trend. Similarly, the orange-colored Hobel's rockcress did the same thing. It had a hard time growing in that crested wheatgrass. It struggled a little bit in the Great Basin wild rye, but it definitely grew a lot easier. The Easter grass more, the control more. And then a funny thing that you see, those are the two forbs. The grasses acted differently. The prairie June grass didn't really seem to show much of a trend. It did like growing in the Great Basin wild rye, did like germinating in the Great Basin wild rye quite a bit more than in the crested wheatgrass, but it didn't like Easter grass. It hates holidays, I guess, and the control still, shows that trend. And the blue bunch wheatgrass, the seed itself had issues. In all of the experiments, it just was, we had a bad batch of seeds, and it wasn't one that we collected, we had bought it. But it had extremely low germination rates, and so I think statistically it might not even be enough germination rates to hold any significance, to hold any power. But so that's that one. Here's more results from experiment 3. Same deal. Now we're talking mean total growth. So this is below ground growth. So this is a measure of the length of the roots, and above ground is a measure of the length of the plant, the above ground growth. All of the litter type categories, the white sagebrush showed an affinity for more of one for growing in the Great Basin wild rye than it did in the crested, as did the Hobel's rockcress, and then the controls kind of leveled out there. That kind of shows that both of these forbs grew just as fine in this Easter grass that mimicked really well this the litter as they did without any litter, showing more evidence for something at a chemical level going on over here. And then as far as the grass went with the litter, it was quite a bit different, and it didn't show a strong trend as all the other results did, and I attribute this to something going on with the way that grass grows in its own litter, is all I can really think. And then harking back to, in a native environment, that litter wouldn't have been built up that way anyway. But that's a stretch in a way. Experiment 4 is an aqueous extract experiment, and so in this case I would make like a pulp or whatever. So I'm going to take litter of those same infestation or those same litter type categories and smush them up, make a not a tea, a what? A leachate, and then I'll use that to water seeds in germination or in Petri dishes. It'll look just like the last experiment. However, there won't be any litter in there. There'll just be this leachate, which will really tease out whether or not it's a physical thing going on or a chemical thing. And I took these methods for this experiment from other allelopathy experiments. It's kind of like one of those just classic ones that you do. And Robert also has a student that used this technique as well. So here's some conclusions that I came to. The big one, the take-home message, that crested wheatgrass is inhibiting restoration and natural colonization of native plants on the mine caps in Butte. And I think if you ask anyone that's ever been involved in the program, they would say F and duh, right? That's based on the literature and BREEZE results. So the BREEZE is the Butte Reclamation Evaluation System. The crested wheatgrass may actually lead to increased mine cap erosion over time. And that's something I saw over and over again in the literature. And so, that it's happening in real life isn't that big of a surprise. I'm excited to say that the next speaker, next week is Montana's star botanist, Peter Lessica, and from his paper in 1996, this is a quote from it: "Planting of crested wheatgrass or other exotic species seems ill-advised." Further research to isolate the specific chemical that's used would provide further scientific knowledge and would be really, really cool, especially if it happened here at Tech. So as long as there is no immediate questions, thank you very much. Ross.
Do you plan to run more experiments using native litter, like finding the average depth of native litter and then growing seeds in that depth?
No, only because the native litter buildup is almost negligible. And so it would essentially be like the control, where there'd be like a stick or two in there. A lot of times when you do go out in the native grassland and you do look at the ground, there was always leaf litter, around. But a lot of times the spaces in between the bunch grasses that aren't native forbs is cryptogrammic crust and other types of ground cover. So that could be done. But I don't plan to do it anyway. Is there any other?
Yeah.
Jeanette?
So if you're saying crested wheatgrass wasn't a good choice, does Butte have any options at this point? Like rip it all up and plant something? I mean, like, is there anything that can be done about it at this point in the game?
Well, part of the deal with the program now is teasing that out. We've worked with BSB and have done a lot of new techniques as far as we've been ripping strips, and there's been a lot of other stuff. It would definitely be a bad idea to rip it all out because, if best case scenario, a bunch of weeds come in so that the caps don't erode off anyway. Was there another part of the question?
No, it was sort of.
We are working on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then one last thing. What do they plant along Silverbow Creek? Did they plant a lot of crested grass along Silverbow Creek?
There's not a lot of crested down there, especially in the area around Fairmount where I hang out all the time fishing. There's a bunch of Great Basin wild rye and there's, what's the other one? There's the Canadian wheatgrass. I forgot the other one. There's a variety. The big deal down there, if you wanted to make an argument about non-native species, is Rich Prodgers' alfalfa, which is showing similar activities, behaviors as the crested, where there's areas where you're just walking through an alfalfa field. For the other, I had an answer for the first part of the question and I just totally spaced it. Uh-oh. Anna, just because she was close.
I have two questions. When you have your germination data, did you follow it to survival ever, or just look at germination?
We took it to a point where stuff starts to, over time, it kind of asymptotes out. Mm-hmm. So we try to get it within the first couple weeks. And then at the same time, it's obviously all harvested on the same time in the same day. And then that's where it's measured.
Okay. And then just, is there any information on, in Eurasia, what breaks down crested wheatgrass? What organisms live with it?
Not that I know of. I would just imagine a plethora of whatever's in their native soil. But I'm not a soil scientist, so I can't even start to answer to that. And
I had some questions. I live below the original mine, and I'm fighting that crested wheatgrass that comes into my yard, and I dig it and dig it and dig it, and I'm building a wall of crested wheatgrass, trying to prevent it from coming in. But I notice on the hill above my house, there's a terrible infestation of Dalmatian toadflax. And I wonder, and I noticed that the agropyron, or with Ludoviciana is growing pretty well in crested wheatgrass. Have you done any work with rhizomatous versus bunchgrass type does the rhizomatous plant grow? I'm wondering why the Dalmatian toadflax is doing, maybe they grew together in Eurasia. Could
Yeah.
that be it? I never thought about that, but that's a Eurasian plant too,
I will
isn't
let
it?
Mark answer if he wants, but I could reflect to that.
Well,
Yeah,
that,
we
that must be what's going, I just came to
Exactly.
now that that's what's probably going on.
So Mark pointed out that one of the pictures that even St. John's wort and thistles are growing together with crested wheatgrass. So they're forming native communities that there,
Right,
and they
right.
co-evolve together, so they know
Yes.
each other. And
Oh.
you know, this is related to allelopathy and lots of things. But I don't want to take away the word from Mark. Just
And the other question I have is, I have had difficulty growing, I call it agropyron spicatum, but it's got a new name I see, and have not had success with it. And so, is it your seeds or is it something else? What is it about blue bunch wheatgrass? Because it's native here, but I don't know, maybe I don't know what I'm doing, but I haven't had any success with it. Do you know anything about that?
We usually have success with it, and it's, I don't know what, if you bought it, where did it come from? Townsend Seeds? That was the issue, because
Lots of places, Wyoming, seed from all over the place, and I haven't had luck with blue bunch wheatgrass. Maybe it just gets trampled. Is it prone to
maybe
trampling?
Crystal would know the answer.
yeah, she'd be the one.
Who's that?
Crystal?
Is it prone to trampling?
I would, number one, I'd probably try to get it as new as possible. Depends on how they clean the seed. And grass seed is notorious for having a lot of empty seeds. So I would personally oversow rather than, they say X amount. I would sow it a lot more heavily, and after 5 years, it's probably not going to be really good seed. You're not going to get the germination you want.
Thank you.
And I did remember one more thing for Jeanette's question, is the development of the more appropriate seed mixes is a good approach. There's already a mess, don't make more of one, right? And then there's also been an experiment we did concerning the 4th of July fire we had in the Syndicate Pit 2 years ago that Robert talks about a lot, where we had one of our sites, one of the older sites, burned down because of a firework, and it was an awesome opportunity to split it up into quadrats and do different types of testing to see what could be done to benefit more the native plant species and see if somehow you could knock back the crested. And he's got some cool results from that. You should ask him.
You know it. You can tell. It's not a secret. Whatever.
It was crazy, is what it really was. It got burned all the way to the ground, probably pretty hot fire, but a lot of grasses like that, right? Because then they get a recharge of nutrients. Then Robert sprayed. I can't do it perfectly how he had done it, but I remember having my mind blown because he sprayed it with a herbicide specifically for grass, and then went to Hawaii and came back and everything was looking fine. So he sprayed it again, and one of the quadrets was what is that? Rototailed. So what we saw really was that. And what I see in the literature is that getting rid of it, because there's been huge restoration projects now on the Great Plains where those Dust Bowl stuff was, right? That's is super intensive, and it takes a lot of treatments over a long amount of time. That's the conclusion sentence in a lot of these papers regarding restoration of crested wheatgrass.
So basically, there was, Mark is right, what we found, the more complex the treatment was. So when we sprayed, it was not quite enough. When we just rototilled, it was not quite enough. But when we used the burning, the spraying and the rototilling, it worked a lot better. And we did not get rid of the whole thing. The roots still stay there. So we did not we didn't touch the integrity of the cap with that. We kind of just knocked back really the crested wheatgrass badly. What we find, the diversity of species coming in and the germination rate of other species that we sown in was the best with the more complex treatment for the crested wheatgrass. That's what came out of that little plot up there.
Is there Stella?
Could you just explain the mechanism of how the crested wheatgrass is leading to
in this case, and I'll try my best, it's a intra-species competition, as well as just the way it's that plant's morphology. So when you go and you spread crested wheatgrass seeds, just like in that mountain con picture, it's all going to come up as little sprouts, and as those sprouts compete with each other, they they minimize their friends. That's the whole idea, and then they form these clumps, and the clumps get bigger and bigger and bigger and minimize more and more friends, and they don't grow together. They stay kind of separate. And the lack of diversity in this situation, in a normal grassland, that space would be filled like with forbs or with, I just said the word, with mosses and lichens and all that kind of stuff. In this case, because it starts as this monotypic stand, there's nothing filling the void. And if something does come and fill the void, it's probably a Dalmatian toadflax, and the county's going to spray it as soon as they see it.
So basically, the pedestal of the grasses leaves channels in between them, so when you end up getting a rain event, the water is kind of driven to these channels in between the pedestals of grasses, and it like washes it, it creates these ravines.
Right, that's the part I left. That's the physical part I left out, totally. So now you've got the a physics thing going on where water's moving over those bare places and being directed, and water acts crazy, especially when it comes to moving soil around, and that does lead to increased erosion. And in this case, this isn't a natural system. It's a cap on a mine waste that needs to stay in place, right? So it's extra important that there's no erosion.
Can I piggyback on for that while I have your attention?
Yeah.
Can you talk about having heavy infestation and moderate infestation? How are you defining heavy and moderate?
That's good. I should have put that up on that slide, and I think you even told me to do that, and I forgot.
Loading questions, I don't know.
Heavy was, I would go and there's areas where I would make a visual assessment that would be 90% or more cover of crested, and then for moderate it was around 75. So the idea is that's pretty standard when you're doing plant monitoring of any kind. You get a little area and you say, how much of this cover of this area a certain plant, and in that case it was 90 or above. I think I did 50 to 75, and then below 50% was my low. Yeah. Is there any others?
So you mentioned using the straws in your experiment for number 3.
Yep.
Experiment 3. Is that your control, or what was the reason for the straws?
It was a control, so it was there was 2 controls in that. I'll show you the picture again. It'll be easier to point at it. So the experiment was between the 2 litters, of course, the native and the non-native, and then the Easter was to mimic and play as a control for the litter itself. Throwing little seeds on sand and then putting something on top of it. And then the control number 2, if you will, is just nothing. And the reason I would do that control is because, like Crystal already mentioned, not all seeds are viable. So I can't really make any assumptions unless I get a baseline of the viability of those seeds. So in this case, say the control was 80%. Now I can say, well, if this was, less than 80%, something's going on there. So that was the idea behind that.
No questions. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you all.
Before everybody goes, Mark already mentioned that basically next week there will be also again a great talk, just basically a follow-up on Mark's talk. It was a coincidence, but it works out really great. So Peter Lessica, who is really the author of our Montana flora and of great findings in our flora, he will come in and he will talk about choosing native species for restoring crested wheatgrass fields. That will be his topic. It's a great honor that he comes because he does not really like the public talks, but he did it for us, and I would appreciate if more and more people would show up because I bet it would be a great talk. Thank you.